Okay, everyone, welcome to week 5 of our international political economy journey. We're moving now more through our part 2, looking at the modern history of international political economy. And now we've just hit the 1970s and 1980s. And today we'll be looking at, amongst a number of things, the rise of neoliberalism on the back of the collapse of the Keynesian post-World War II global economic order. So let's have a look at the learning objectives for today. Just going to double check that I'm recording because I'm incredibly paranoid. Yes, we're all good. Um, these are the learning objectives for today. You can find these on Moodle as well. There's quite a few that we're going to be trying to get through. And this week, we just only have 2 required readings. So, yeah, it's not too much. And I'd really recommend you guys to have a look at some of the recommended readings, especially the text by David Harvey and also by Quinn Slobodian. They're both quite recent, and especially Quinn Slobodian's volume Globalists are very recent studies into neoliberalism. And Slobodian especially has been a bit of a path setter for understanding new perspectives around what neoliberalism is, which I will reference during this lecture as well. So I guess maybe before we move on any further, I just want to very briefly recap what we talked about last week. Basically, we started having a look at, well, what was the post-World War II global international economic order. And we discussed how as a liberal economic order that rose in the ashes of World War II. We saw the birth of the IMF and the World Bank at Bretton Woods, and then the general policy framework of Western industrialized countries orientated towards one based on Keynesian economics. And we also had a look at development in the so-called third world, and left last week with this idea of increasing global turbulence, increased financial flows as productivity got constrained around the world, and there was more and more disjunctions. So not only were developing countries increasingly unhappy that their approaches to development, either following like a modernization Western model or following more nationalist and dependency theory based ideas, both were not really meeting the aims of the developing countries, and they got increasingly dissatisfied. And then also in the Western industrial world, Keynesian economics were not meeting the increasing crises that were popping up during the 60s. And the productivity was stalling as well, wages were also stalling, and so there was a lot of discontent. And that then feeds in nicely to one of the first major events that we'll talk about in opening this lecture about the 1970s and 80s is to start at the end of the 1960s. And to discuss the 1968 revolution, so this was a really broad global revolution, which appeared very different in lots of different contexts. But it was overall, it was the combination of long existing anger about the workings of the world system and disappointment with the capacity of like systemic movements at that time to transform the world that led to this kind of outpouring of anger around late 1960s. The explosions of 1968 contained 2 really key themes that were like virtually repeated everywhere, whatever the local context might be. One was the rejection of US hegemonic power, simultaneously with the complaint that the Soviet Union, which was the presumed antagonist of the United States, was actually colluding in the world order that the United States had established. And the second was that the traditional anti-systemic movements had not fulfilled their promises once they got into power. So more like progressive third wave or in between these global power kind of movements, once they kind of achieve some kind of power, they're always very disappointing. And the combination of these complaints, which were so widely repeated, constituted a cultural like earthquake. And the many uprisings that were around the world, most prominently in France, as well as in Czechoslovakia, but really at a global scale, they were like a phoenix, and they and they were popping up and then collapsing in on themselves quite quickly, and none of them really sustained any political power as such for any particular leaders or movements of 1968. But it was a cultural shock, and the cultural shock of 1968 unhinged the automatic dominance of the liberal centre and of some of the nostrums and assumptions of the global post-World War II economic order, which had prevailed in the world system since really the mid 1800s. The right and the left of politics were liberated as such from the more centrist liberalism, common sense around this time, and were able to then assert more radical values during the late 1960s. The world system had started to enter into this period of transition, and both the right and left political fractions were determined to take advantage of the increasing chaos to ensure that their values would prevail in a new system or systems that would maybe emerge from the crisis. And the immediate effect that was quite visible from the world revolution of 1968 seemed to be this legitimation of left values, and especially in the cultural sphere, and probably most notably in the domains of race and sex. So racism had been a pervasive feature of the modern world system for basically all of its existence. Its legitimacy has of course, been called into question at various times over the last couple of centuries, but it was only really after the world revolution of 1968 and associated ideas and struggles around that time that a widespread campaign against racism, which was led by the oppressed groups themselves, as distinguished from those previously led primarily by liberals among the dominant classes. This became a central phenomenon on the world political scene at this time, taking the form of both actively militant identity movements everywhere and of attempts to reconstruct the world of knowledge to make the issues deriving from chronic racism central to intellectual discourse. And along with the debates about racism, it would have been hard to really miss the centrality of sexuality to the world revolution of 1968 at this time as well. Thinking about the impact of 1968, it helped bring to the forefront what had been a very slow transformation of sexual norms in the preceding 50 years or so. And 1968 allowed it to explode onto the world social scene with enormous consequences for the law, for customary practice, for religions, and for intellectual discourse as well. And as a result, with this kind of increase, what we might sort of call leftist ideas around sexual norms and race, the post 1968 reaction was split kind of in two different ways, between, on the one hand, an establishment attempt to restore order, whether that was in Western countries or in the Soviet Union, and solve some of the immediate difficulties of what was also an emerging profit squeeze, where there was a real dry up of profits with the Keynesian system prevailing in the Western industrial states. And on the other hand, a more narrowly based but much more ferocious, arguably, counter revolution in the cultural sphere. So a coalition of what you might call centrist and rightist forces around the world in response to the 1968 revolutions attempted to roll back the rising costs of production in the entire production process to help stimulate more profit around that time as well. They sought to also reduce remuneration levels and also cheapen the cost of inputs as well, reduce taxation for the benefit of the welfare state. So, previously, as I mentioned last week, like education, health, pension and so forth was often provided by the state apparatus, and they wanted to unroll that. And so there was a broad offensive across many different forms in an attempt to, re-stimulate profit making, which had stagnated by this time. There was also a replacement of the theme of developmentalism, which had prevailed at that time And we spoke last week how after World War II, the idea of developmentism, which was this like modernizing, industrializing process, which was it was a mainstream discourse after World War II. The liberal center of many mainstream global politics and economic institutions start to abandon this theme of developmentalism in and of itself, especially as a mode of like overcoming global polarization and inequalities, and instead replaced it with the theme of globalization, which would see echo more and more over the next 40 or so years. And this theme of globalization instead called essentially for the opening of frontiers to the free flow of goods and capitals, but importantly, not of labor all the time. And importantly, and we'll touch on this in a bit more detail quite soon, is that the Thatcher regime in the United Kingdom and the Reagan regime in the United States took the lead in promoting these policies, which were called, neoliberalism as theory and the Washington Consensus as policy. Both of these we'll come back to in more detail. And importantly, and we don't really touch on this too much here, but the World Economic Forum, which was birthed, I think, around the early 1970s, was the locus for promoting a lot of these theoretical innovations, or well, not really innovations, but I guess the theoretical progress of neoliberalism. And the International Monetary Fund, as well as the World Bank, were the chief enforcers of the Washington Consensus. So these are kind of some of the reactions at the mainly economic level to this rising tide of leftist cultural norms after 1968. Now, importantly, the economic difficulties that were faced by governments everywhere from the 1970s onwards, and particularly for those countries in the global south and also in the Soviet Union, made it extremely difficult for these states to resist the pressure for like structural change of their economy in response to this. And this process of this structural change of their economy would be called structural adjustment, which would necessitate, among many things, the opening of their borders and frontiers to international capital, because these countries desperately needed money. But again, this is something we'll go into more detail very soon. And so after these kind of initial moves, there was a limited amount of success in rolling back the costs of production, but still a success far below what promoters of these new kind of neoliberal or opening policies had hoped for, and far below also what was necessary to end the squeeze and minimizing on profits. So more and more capitalists then started seeking profits in different areas, not just production. And so there was a move towards financial speculation, and these financial speculation movements started to create quite slowly, great profits for some players in the market. But it also equally rendered the world economy very volatile and subject to swings of currencies and of employment. And it is, in fact, probably one of the signs of increasing chaos. And we'll explore these movements towards finalization now and also in subsequent weeks. So at the moment, and really just to recap a little bit of what we spoke about last week, is that by this stage, at the end of the 1960s, there really was a breakdown of this Keynesian system. And in this environment where the state couldn't respond to the economic challenges that it faced, whether that was decreasing or stagnating production, stagnating profits, increased pressure from industrialists and capitalists, as well as increased pressure from labor who wanted better wages and better living conditions. These things started to wear down the Keynesian system, and this created an environment where neoliberal norms finally started to acquire real traction. Now, the eventual kind of dominance of neoliberalism as an intellectual creed and an apparatus was a very complicated process. And here I'll only kind of discuss three, or what I feel are three main antecedents or things prior to its emergence that helped it come to fruition. And again, very much interlinked. A lot of these three processes I'll talk about are not only things that are kind of prior to the I guess, the flowering of neoliberalism, but also went hand in hand with it as it got stronger as well. So these processes are, and I have these on the slides here. Firstly, the deepening of financialization and the ending of the par value system of Bretton Woods that we spoke about last week. Two, the increasing debt obligations of third world countries. And three, the international financial institutions, which is the IMF and the World Bank, their structural adjustment programs. We'll then note the impact of these three developments concurrently to the so-called developing world, and especially on marginalized groups such as women, alongside the leveraging of women's social reproductive labor at this time for neoliberal expansion, because it is a story that is often missed. Then we'll finally discuss what exactly neoliberalism is. Now, finalization, or as defined by some key scholars, the tendency for profit making in the economy to occur increasingly through financial channels. Financialization has played a really significant role in capitalist accumulation, expansion, and debt abstraction. Now, the opportunities for profit in financial markets really expanded significantly with the end of the par value system. Now, remember, the fixed conversion of US dollars to gold at about $35 an ounce was a key tenet of the Bretton Woods system, but it began to unravel in the 1960s. This is for a few reasons, but it's probably mainly because of a worsening balance of payments crisis in the United States due to the Vietnam War, as well as increased domestic spending. So the US had committed huge amounts of money to the military efforts in Vietnam, which were failing. And there was also domestic pressure to expand social programs in the US. So there's a lot of domestic costs as well. So basically, the US was spending more money than it had. Now, by 1971, the United States was unable to stem the outflow of US dollars because the US dollar is was and is the global currency. Like every other country around the world wanted to have US dollars to be able to affect international trade. So there was always an outflow of US dollars from the United States. So the United States was unable to stem the outflow of US dollars that it also really needed. And it also couldn't convert billions of dollars into gold, as was demanded by leading European countries at that time. And instead, the United States unilaterally ended the par value system. And so that meant that there was no longer a fixed value of gold to a US dollar. And that also meant that other currencies also wouldn't be fixed to the US dollar. And so this eventually led, and not automatically, but after some period of time, this automatically led to what we now call a free floating exchange rates between national currencies, where national currencies would be valued alongside each other based on many different factors, and is the kind of system we have prevailing now. And importantly, for one of the institutions we spoke about last week, the International Monetary Fund, and remember, the International Monetary Fund's role was to regulate the par value system. So once the par value system collapsed, then it seemed like the International Monetary Fund then had nothing to do. But importantly, and we won't go into like huge amounts of detail here as to how this happened, but the IMF slowly started to reorientate its focus towards providing money for developing countries, which was seen at that time as an area that there wasn't a huge lot of work in. So the ending of this par value system coincided with the new also financial liberalism that promoted speculative capital movements across the globe. And importantly, around this time, derivative markets around the world started to develop. This is where like speculators and financiers could gamble on future prices of commodities or currencies and reap really huge financial rewards. Popular like derivatives at this stage were forward, future, and option contracts. And these are derivative instruments that would become more and more complicated as the years went on. Now, just very briefly, a derivative, and this is not a major focus of our interest here, but a derivative is basically a contract that's derived, that has its value derived from an underlying asset. So a futures contract, for instance, is a type of derivative instrument. It's a contract where someone, for example, might contract to sell a specific quantity of maybe like wheat, for example, at a fixed price to a buyer, say like in 6 months from now. Now, if the price of the wheat falls below the contract price when the contract expires, then the seller benefits because they sell their wheat at a higher price that was locked in. So this is a simplified explanation of what a derivative instrument is, and a futures contract is a type of derivative instrument. Now, in the global market today, there's billions of these, contracts being exchanged, like, across the course of the day. And so very minor changes in value, for instance, multiplied over billions of times makes that huge amounts of money. But going into the derivative markets and how they work is not a major focus here, unfortunately. But there is some very good literature on financialization, which I can link anyone who's interested. Now, despite the declining productivity growth rates, which we mentioned throughout the 1970s, the value of financial assets skyrocketed. So the daily derivative trading turnover climbed to US $1.4 trillion by 1998, and then even increased even further to US $4.2 trillion by 2007. This is the daily derivative turnover, which is just before the GFC, importantly. And also foreign exchange markets similarly exploded as well, in such a way that by the end of the 1990s, foreign exchange trade, where the exchange of money more or less, was 10 times greater than the global annual gross domestic product. So a huge explosion. And these developments laid down the skeleton of what we now know as finalization, which would be quite typical of neoliberal capitalism in the 1980s. Now, a lot of authors look at financialization in this period and say this is the sole period of financialization. This is a totally new thing in capitalism, for example. But one of the things that we'll see a new theory does, that we'll introduce, world systems theory, is take what's called a longue durée approach to understanding social processes. And in fact, this is something also that we've spoken about before, where many critical theories do this. They take what is called either simply a historical look at social phenomena. So they try to understand the appearance of social phenomena based on, the history preceding that. And that can also be called taking a longue durée approach. So that's a term you might see in the literature. So taking this longue durée or historical approach sees the financialization that bloomed in the 1970s and 1980s as another turn on the cyclical kind of crises embodying capitalism. And there has been financial turns before, even in the early 1900s, for example. But the interesting thing about this period is that in the 1970s and 80s, not only was this increased financialization, but also unprecedented investor power that accompanied this like financial turn. And this process of financialization has had a widespread effects on commodity prices and debt. And debt has been especially an important factor to explain the development of a neoliberal sensibility at the individual level, but also how neoliberalism took hold in the global South. So let's go now to debt in the global South. And with this kind of increasingly financialized global economy, the kind of capacity for states, and especially developing countries, to regulate their relationships with international markets was reduced. So, I mentioned in last week that a lot of the developing countries tried to industrialize as their model of development. They tried to protect their emerging industries. But this became a lot harder as, capital and capital started moving quickly across borders, and money would flow in and out of countries. It was very hard to actually plan or regulate the economies of these countries. And so there was an emerging consensus at this time towards the removal of capital controls, as well as marketing boards and other state-based regulations, which basically tried to control the amount of capital movement into these countries, which meant that states were then suddenly or were vulnerable, I guess, to the sudden withdrawal of international capital and an increase in the cost of goods. Now, an example of this was after the 1973 oil crisis, when the OPEC countries announced oil embargoes to countries who supported Israel during the 1973 war. This kind of reduced production and reduced oil in the marketplace, increased oil costs for everyone, and didn't just impact the countries under the embargo, but non-oil producing countries in the global south then had huge problems paying their debts basically, and having enough money to operate their economies, because there was a hugely increased cost of oil, which was obviously very important for fueling their very slowly and industrializing nascent economies. And the increased, and related speculation on financial markets also increased volatility in like the, commodity and oil prices at that time as well. Now, equally, when that was happening with global south countries who aren't producing oil, they started to have problems, paying for things because oil was so incredibly expensive. The countries in the so-called global south who were oil producers, like the OPEC countries, they then got huge amounts of money because they were selling oil at so many dollars a barrel. And what they did was, with that money, they then reinvested that into US banks. And this was due to the relative stability and strength of the US economy at that time, and still is the case, which created a swell of capital into US banks from the petrostates. And this money going to the US was called petrodollars. And these US banks suddenly had all this money, which came from the OPEC countries. And again, at this time, I mentioned that the production of goods, and profit through production of goods was at an all-time low. And so there's few avenues for these banks to reinvest all this money into production. And expansionary investment into industrial countries. And so international banks started lending these huge, vast amounts of money to debt-ridden countries of the global south, who, as I mentioned before, were the countries who were now struggling to buy things. And so in a cyclical kind of way, the cause of them not being able to buy a lot of things, which was the oil crisis, engineered by the OPEC states, meant the OPEC states got a lot of money. The money went to the US banks, and the US banks then lent it back to the struggling global south countries. And they did this with minimal conditions. So it was a lot of lending with generally high interest rates. But the problem was that this flood of money didn't help overcome the structural problems that were faced by post-colonial countries. Again, I mentioned this briefly last week, that a lot of these countries had their economies orientated around the production of primary commodities. And so, that they'd simply receive this money from US banks. They'd try to industrialize and, have to keep repaying off their loans, and they'd have to keep trying to produce more commodities to get more money to pay off their loans. And with a huge flood of primary commodities into the market, this also decreased the value of these primary commodities at this time. So these developing countries are receiving less money than they normally would. So these structural constraints, which is very much from the colonial period, impacted the ability for these countries to service their loans. And as such, the external third world debt ballooned from about 47.5 billion across the entire so-called third world in 1968 to 560 billion by the end of the 1970s. And at this time as well, interesting enough, that there's a lot of things going on. The United States started to then experience increased inflation, and as well as large outflows of capital as well. And foreign investors started to even lose faith in the dollar by the mid 1970s. Now, as a solution to this these problems, along with many others, the chairman of the US Federal Reserve, Paul Volcker, he applied really strict limits on the growth of the money supply in October 1979. And this was called the Volcker shock. And that immediately reduced inflation and allowed US interest rates to skyrocket. And when the US interest rates skyrocket, that affects, consumer spending, which created a domestic recession and also forced many US-based manufacturing facilities and other firms of, traditional union strength in the United States to close, which also broke the back of labor in the United States, because this was also a key ploy by Paul Volcker and the US Federal Reserve, is that at this time in the 70s, there was a lot of labor agitation. And so the sudden high interest rates really contracted consumer spending, forced factories to close, and many of those factories had strong union jobs. So then labor-intensive production was transferred to locations in the global south that had much cheaper labor. Now, because of these high interest rates, the value of the US dollar also increased comparative to other countries. And so that also meant that the relatively increased dollar increased the debt of borrowing nations in the global south, because the debt was denominated in US dollars. So as a brief illustration, if a global south country owed, just for simplistic sake, $100 to a bank, and let's just say before the Volcker shock, they'd have to pay $200 or 200 units of their own currency to service that $100. When that value of that $100 increases because of the Volcker shock, then maybe they might need 400 units of their currency to pay that back. So it became much harder for these countries to service their interest rates from the loans that they received previously. And this also had the effect that more money from the global south then went to the United States, because they needed to pay more to service their debts, and then increased capital back into US banks then meant that there was more credit for the United States financial expansion and increased military spending in the 1980s, which also had a big impact on the Cold War as well, which is something we will explore next week, I believe. So these processes all together, which is, a lot of things going on here, still strengthened the development of financialization as well, and began to imbue everyday logic with the idea of debt servicing, and the necessity to maintain debt servicing by countries and as well at the individual level. And the massive outflow of capital and then cheap exports from the global south then helped capitalists in the global north to have not only their loans repaid, but also the cheap inputs that were necessary for production. So then that would help their profiteering again. So at this historical junction of all these factors combining, this was when the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank rose to prominence as a disciplinary force against the developing countries to impose strict regimes of debt servicing that has persisted over time. So we're going to have a look now at the new mandate for the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank to impose what was called structural adjustment programs. Now, the inability for the global south countries to service their debts peaked with the 1982 debt crisis, and this primarily affected Latin American borrowers. The IMF at this time, and remember we mentioned that the IMF, they weren't in charge of the power value system anymore. They were searching for a new mission. They started to become more and more involved in development. The IMF at this time was tasked with basically extracting the maximum possible debt service payments from debtor countries and preventing major defaults permanently affecting the lending banks in the global north. The IMF, as I mentioned last week, is very much a creature of the Western industrialized nations. And so as a primary concern of them to make sure the IMF would enforce the payment of debts by the global South countries to the banks of the global North. And so the IMF required so-called global South countries to apply what is now known as structural adjustment policies, which aim generally to liberalize economies, open markets up to international trade, deregulate credit and capital controls, and also reduce the state sector. The IMF at this time was under intense pressure by the US Treasury to implement these adjustment policies, and it started to go more into the domestic policy choices of recipient countries. And it did this by basically saying, like, here, developing country, here is, a few $billion, but if you're going to accept this, here's some conditions that you need to impose. And these conditions were based very much on neoclassical supply-side economics, which started to emerge at this time as an economic theory of consensus. The IMF placed emphasis on consumption as the primary variable that impacted the balance of payment deficits of a developing country. So that meant that if a developing country, couldn't pay back its loans and had increased debt and increased deficits, it could correct this by increasing production while decreasing consumption and maintaining investment. So consumption means like austerity policies, basically. So restricting the purchasing power of the populace while increasing exports to get foreign money that they can then use to pay back their loans. This so-called supply side thinking would then inform the IMF and the World Bank's approach to conditionality, where measures such as the reform of trade regimes, sectoral adjustment policies, revision of public sector enterprises, increased private investments, improving debt management, and instigating institutional reform would be overwhelmingly favored. Now, this new approach by the IMF was a really important development, and the IMF was increasingly getting involved in this work. And by the mid-1980s, the IMF started to introduce formalized programs introducing these policies in the developing countries, and it named these policies the Structural Adjustment Facility, and basically a line of credit countries could apply for, which they could receive based on conditions, and then the Enhanced Structural Adjustment Facility, which is more of the same, but just a longer time period. And by the end of the 1980s, with the increased involvement of the IMF, especially here, but also the World Bank, most bilateral aid to the Global South was linked to the acceptance of IMF conditionality through these particular facilities. And concurrently, at the same time, not to be outdone, the World Bank created what was called the Structural Adjustment Loan, which also offered loans for balance of payment support in exchange for policy reform. So very similar to the IMF. Both the development of the World Bank's structural adjustment loans and the IMF's structural adjustment facility brought the international financial institutions closer together in terms of their operational procedures, their emerging ideology, and also in their country-specific interventions. These institutions from Bretton Woods dominated the developing political economy at this time, at this like junction of restructuring, which was backed by the US Treasury. And this demonstrated the universalizing norms of what was retrospectively called the Washington Consensus, which shaped the Global South on behalf of international dominant fractions of capital, and especially financial fractions of capital. Now, the term Washington Consensus emerged a little bit later during the conference to assess the progress of policy reform in Latin America, which was held in 1990, and it referred to a policy package that was gaining acceptance among Washington-based institutions and economists, hence the name Washington Consensus. This package included fiscal discipline, cutting public expenditure, broadening the tax base, financial liberalization, low exchange rates, trade liberalization, enhanced access for foreign capital, privatization, deregulation, and firm property rights. These were important aspects of the Washington Consensus, and you can think of the Washington Consensus as like the policy suite that introduced neoliberalism into much of the developing world. And importantly, in this course too, we don't just leave it at the Washington Consensus. Over the coming weeks, we will track the Washington Consensus and how it evolves to the post-Washington Consensus, and then in the final weeks of the course, how it evolves to the Wall Street Consensus, which is what we are seeing now. Now, following the 1982 debt crisis, structural adjustment increased capital and trade flows from the global south to the north, assisted by multinational corporations, international banks, and importantly, international financial institutions. Continuing at this stage, the bond and derivative financial markets grew exponentially. And so there was more and more financial flows across the globe. Now, the structural adjustment programs were actually very disappointing from a macroeconomic and development perspective. Generally, like 6 years after these programs were initiated, most recipient countries only demonstrated very slight improvements, if any at all, in their previously, disastrous macroeconomic indicators. So like the growth in median per capita income in the global south actually stagnated or decreased in this era of structural adjustment programs. Blanket deflationary policies cut employment, reduced real income levels, and destroyed national prosperity in borrowing countries. Currency devaluations would often spark huge movements of capital out of affected countries, which triggered national collapse or regional crisis. And then the IMF and the World Bank were also directly responsible for widespread political unrest, as these reforms brought pain for millions. And there was huge protests across the world, such as in Sudan, Malawi, Peru, Egypt, and Jordan, but among many other places as well. And so this period was also known not just as the era of structural adjustment lending, but the lost decade. So the lost decade of development, where countries like backslid. Now, let's look at the impact of these restructuring programs, and we'll do this through our feminist critical political economy lens and have a look at the gender impact. The literature has broadly identified 6 main ways in which these structural adjustment policies have had very distinctly gendered impacts. Firstly, the downsized public sectors have led to proportionally more unemployed women. Decreased education has pressured girls to withdraw from school. The privatization of public land has particularly impacted women's livelihoods. For the cuts to social services have increased more care labor on women. Deflation has impacted women's purchasing power and also concentrated male ownership in export production. And 6, increased food prices have generally tended to impoverish more women and children. And also the pivot towards what we now know as neoliberalism in economic life acted to reshape also like popular feminist ideals in the Western world. Previously, more emancipatory feminist demands were co-opted by the developing neoliberal paradigm throughout the 1980s, and women were increasingly utilized as dispensable and cheap workers across the globe and recast as entrepreneurs who are governed through markets and incentives. Neoliberal doctrines moved demands of feminist movements away from societal transformation, which was obviously crucial in like the late 1960s and 70s even, and towards the recognition of female identity and difference. The proletarianization of women at this time, where women massively moved into work, especially in the Western industrial world, added the necessity to complete paid work on top of unpaid labor in the home, which was called the second shift. For capitalism as a global project, which was again at this time faced with declines in productivity and profit outside of the financial sphere, women's reproductive labor and the harnessing of it and the use of it was one of the last great commodity frontiers. So there was a huge move to integrate women into this so-called productive economy. But even with this integration, women's reproductive labor has been deepened by and dependent on adjustment programs. So social reproduction has been the object of structural adjustment as an avenue for privatization and extraction, and the related phenomenon of financialization has also deepened women's reproductive labor through greater debt obligations in the household. So there's a whole range of gendered impacts, which I can only kind of briefly note here, but some of the further readings do go into this in some more detail. Now, after going through the policy suite around neoliberalism and some of the antecedents of its emergence, now let's actually talk about, well, what is neoliberalism? Now, the processes of deepening financialization, increased debt, dominance of structural adjustment programs, subordination of women's social reproductive labor have contributed all to a material, ideological, and philosophical realignment towards a neoliberal sensibility. Now, typically, many accounts of neoliberalism focus on two main tenets. First, neoliberalism is a re-emphasis and reassertion of the classic liberalism of laissez-faire that dominated parts of the 19th century. And second, the origin of neoliberalism is placed within the collaboration of the Mont Pelerin Society, which gathered around Friedrich von Hayek, that successfully promoted neoliberal philosophy until it gained prominence in the 1980s. Now, both of these tenets, which you'll probably hear in other courses, have a great deal of truth, and they're certainly very important to understand neoliberalism. But it's important to emphasize that the contemporary phenomenon of neoliberalism is not purely a revival of classic liberalism. And there's maybe two major points that I want to stress with you here, and some differences to emphasize. And I'll go into these in more detail in a moment. But first, the rationality of neoliberalism attempts to pervade every aspect of life and disseminate market values throughout a social totality, which has sought to remake society towards and legitimating itself through a blind pursuit of economic growth. That's the first point. The second point is that the project of neoliberalism, which is an integrative project, is not only economic, cultural, but also intensely political. It seeks to equally encase the economic domain from the political, right? So it protects the economic domain. And I'll talk about this more in a moment. But the boundless strategy of growth, as well as the protection of the economic, is backed up by a nation-state system of coercion that ensures a liberal imperative worldwide, which requires military action and repression without end, which is often enacted on ethnicized, racialized, and gendered populations of the global south. So let's go on to these 2 points I wanted to make in some more detail. Now, firstly, at the level of rationality, or we might understand it as ways of being, the important point is that neoliberalism is not just an economic policy as the laissez-faire of classic liberalism could be classified as, but it's a rationality that structures and organizes the actions of rulers and the conduct of the ruled. This rationality is based not solely on the best interests or maximizing capacity of classic liberalism, but in the so-called entrepreneurial essence of every human, state, and institution. So there's not been a straightforward retreat of the state pulling away from the market as classic liberalism demanded, but a reorientation to promote and create the conditions for enterprise competition, which is also important in the second point I'll touch on soon. People have been disciplined by the accountability of employers, shareholders, the stock market, and humans are reorientated as profit centers and capital to be valorized. Even in such a way that all of us to think about what job are we going to do? How are we going to contribute to profit making? People ask about what's your social capital, for instance. That's even how we see relationships even. So this neoliberal rationality, or Foucault scholars would call governance, has reinforced capital social relations throughout society. Individuals are regarded not just as consumers, but also producers. So even in today with social media, you're not just consuming social media, but you can also produce content, which then creates more value for Facebook, for instance, or Instagram, or whoever it might be. So all your actions can be seen as potentially economic and entrepreneurial. And with this kind of veneration of entrepreneurial individualism, a failure for someone to achieve success is usually then due to their lack of entrepreneurial skills, their laziness even, or even, not enough hard work. And this rationality, which creates this entrepreneurial subject throughout society, can then aid the dismantling of social services because it should just be on, your own back and your role as an entrepreneur to create opportunities and profit for yourself. It helps with the dismantling of like pension, public education, and health system, which are demanded in reforms. And so with this kind of individualism and entrepreneurialism a supreme value, the taking away of like universal healthcare, the lack of job stability, are then instead cast in the guise of its opposite, as freedom to choose. You're not losing things, like you're not losing universal healthcare. You have a freedom to choose between lots of different private healthcare providers. You're not, in a unstable a job without stability, but you have the freedom to choose your career. So you have these kind of unfreedoms are cast as freedoms for the entrepreneurial subject. So it's crucial in a way to conceptualize neoliberalism as well as, as a rational society as well, rather than just policy, as a key part of a social totality that has created a capitalist market civilization with a perspective on the world that is highly economistic. So that's our main point about rationality. Now, and that mainly at the individual. Now, if we look at the broader level of the totality or the entire social system, and this is my second point, neoliberalism was conceptualized and developed as an integrative ideology and political doctrine, not just an economic one. And I really recommend, if anyone's interested in this, is to read Quinn Slobodian's work, Globalists, which is a very recent book, which has really been a path setter to new research into neoliberalism, which is the resource I'm using for this part of the lecture here. Now, theorists in this tradition of neoliberalism employed the ideas of a number of, I guess, like jurisprudence authors who sought to think or conceptualize how the market economy can be protected by instability. And really prominently were the ideas of Carl Schmitt, who is a prominent Nazi jurist. And I've got a podcast that I've linked as an extra reading on this point, where the ideas of Carl Schmitt was very much orientated around how can we inoculate capitalism against the threat of democracy. And that was by establishing multi-tiered governance institutions that insulated the economic realm from the political. So this wasn't, again, just the rollback of the state. So the state wasn't just withdrawing like, the laissez-faire neoliberalism might think, even though it was rhetorically promoted as such. And you see it even today where politicians and media personalities and whoever would talk about, the state's doing too much, like it's, the state, it's got too much debt, it's got, its hands in every pie. But really, one of the underlying projects of neoliberalism is a strengthening of the state in a lot of crucial areas to protect the market economy, as well as supranational institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank, and particularly in the strength of the police, the courts, locking countries into international agreements that can't get out of, or even empowering the IMF and the World Bank to protect the economy. So the active role for the government, non-government, and supranational institutions in protecting the market economy is seen in this view as the purpose of neoliberalism, and became an important focus of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank in development, as we'll see over the course of the next few weeks. And so these policymakers, whether at the state or international level, were focused on protecting the economic dominium from the problematic and unstable world or political realm of the imperium. And these tactics and strategies would evolve over subsequent decades in response to changes in the global political economy. The initial manner by which the economic dominion was protected from disruptive political forces throughout the turbulent 1970s and 1980s was predominantly through these structural adjustment programs we spoke about, which applied harsh discipline and austerity on unruly labor, while also facilitating private capital accumulation through privatization, marketization, and other Washington consensus policies. And um, as we mentioned before, even with these structural adjustment programs, development failed, but the labor as a global movement was really broken. And with with these new developments, and then as we'll see with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the approach of like the neoliberal integrative project to varying global situations would change how exactly the economic dominion would be protected from the political. And again, we'll be discussing this in a few weeks' time. So that was neoliberalism. Now we're going to pop over to RP theory, and I realize this has gone on for a little bit already, but please pause, take a break. This last section isn't too long, but it's now just drawing together the history of what we've been speaking about so far, and then how does international political economy fit into this? Um, and at the end of the last lecture, we mentioned about how the varying crises at the end of the 1960s started to spawn a reconstituted field of international political economy. So we'll now discuss some of these emergent areas and fields, which of course all have intellectual traditions stretching back a long way, but they started to become, I guess, like more identifiably, like individual theories at this stage in this reconstituted field of international political economy. We're going to deal with liberalism or neoliberalism, and also mercantilism and world systems theory as well. So let's head over to liberalism. So we have to also distinguish between like neoliberalism in terms of economic policy doctrine and the points that I just made before to liberalism as theory. Because liberal economic theory generally is committed to free markets and minimal state interventions. This is the classic laissez-faire liberalism. But as I will kind of touch on, the emphasis on one or the other might differ in certain particular times and with certain particular theorists. But liberal political theory is committed to individual equality and liberty, although again the emphasis may differ. But here we're kind of primarily concerned with the economic component of liberal theory. And the liberal perspective on political economy is really embodied in the discipline of economics as it's developed in Great Britain, the US, and Western Europe. Adam Smith was an early proponent, and his tradition and thought has stretched to contemporary proponents. And liberal thinkers have shared a coherent set of assumptions and beliefs about the nature of human beings, society, and economic activities. Liberalism has assumed many forms: classical liberalism, neoclassical, Keynesian, monetarist, Austrian, rational expectation, and so on and so forth. These variants range from those giving priority to equality and tending towards social democracy and state intervention to achieve liberal objectives, such as like Keynesianism, to those stressing more liberty and non-interventionists at the expense of social equality, such as laissez-faire economics. Now, all forms of economic liberalism generally are committed to the market and the price mechanism as the most efficacious means for organizing domestic and international economic relations. So liberalism may be defined as a doctrine and set of principles for organizing and managing a market economy in order to achieve maximum efficiency, economic growth, and individual welfare. So economic liberalism assumes that a market kind of arises spontaneously in order to satisfy human needs, and that once it's in operation, it functions in accordance with its own like internal logic. Human beings are by nature, in this view, economic animals, and so therefore markets evolve naturally without central direction. And as Adam Smith put it, and you may have seen in your readings in the first week, it's inherent in mankind to truck, barter, and exchange. Now, the rationale for such a market system is that it increases economic efficiency, maximizes economic growth, and therefore improves human welfare. Although liberals believe that economic activity also enhances the power and security of the state, they do argue that the primary objective of economic activity is to benefit individual consumers. Their ultimate defense of free trade and open markets is that they increase the range of goods and services available to the consumer. And the fundamental premise of liberalism is that the individual consumer, firm, or household is the basis of society. So it's individual focused, where individuals behave rationally, they attempt to maximize or satisfy certain values at the lowest possible cost to themselves. So economics, the field and study of economics, or rather, the economics which is taught in most American universities, and Marxists would call them orthodox or bourgeois economics, is assumed to be an empirical science of maximizing behavior, where behavior is believed to be governed by a set of economic laws that are impersonal and politically neutral, and therefore economics and politics should and can be separated into distinct spheres. Governments generally, again, through the ideology of liberal theory, government should not intervene in the market except when a market failure exists, or to provide, a so-called public or collective good. And the market economy, in this view, is governed principally by the law of demand, or maybe, assumption, we might say. This law holds that people will buy more of a good if the relative price falls, and less if it rises. People will also tend to buy more of a good as their relative income rises and less as it falls. So any development that changes the relative price of a good or the relative income of an actor will create an incentive or disincentive to acquire or produce more or less of the good. So this law in turn has profound ramifications throughout society. Whereas if on the supply side of the economy, liberal economics assumes that individuals pursue their interests in a world of scarcity and resource constraints. This is a fundamental and inescapable condition of human existence, where every decision involves an opportunity cost, a trade-off among alternative uses of available resources. And like I mentioned briefly before, liberalism assumes that the market economy exhibits a powerful tendency towards equilibrium and inherent stability, at least over a long term. This concept of like a self-operating, self-correcting equilibrium, which is achieved by a balance of forces in a rational universe, is a really crucial one for the economist's beliefs in the operation of markets and the laws that are believed to govern them. And finally, I guess the other kind of main assumption is that a lot of present-day liberal economists believe in progress, defined which is most frequently as like an increase in wealth per capita. They assert that the growth of a properly functioning economy is, linear, it's gradual and continuous, and it proceeds along what an economist has called the MIT standard equilibrium growth curve. Other political or events such as, wars, revolution, or natural disasters might dramatically disrupt this growth path, but the economy will return eventually to this stable pattern of growth that is determined principally by, increases in population, resources, and productivity. And liberals see no real progress or connection, I guess, between the processes of economic growth and political development, such as war and imperialism. These political evils affect and may be affected by economic activity, but they are essentially caused by political and not by economic factors. So there's this real separation between the economic and political. Now, going forward even more, and this will be a briefer section on mercantilism or economic nationalism. And this has gone as well, like liberalism, under lots of different metamorphoses over the past few centuries. It's been known as just mercantilism, statism, protectionism, the German historical school, and recently new protectionism or neo-mercantilism. Throughout all of these kind of changes, there's often sets of themes or attitudes that are quite, that make up kind of a coherent and systematic body of economic or political theory. And its central idea really is that economic activities are and should be subordinate to the goal of state building and the interests of the state. All nationalists ascribe to the primacy of the state, of national security, and of military power in the organization and functioning of the international system. Economic nationalists stress the role of economic factors in international relations and view the struggle among states whether they're capitalist, socialist, or whatever, for economic resources as pervasive and indeed inherent in the nature of the international system. Um, and, as one writer has put it, since economic resources are necessary for national power, every conflict is at once both economic and political. States, at least, over the long run, simultaneously pursue wealth and natural power. So economic nationalism, kind of both in the early modern era and today, arises in part from the tendency of markets to concentrate wealth and to establish dependency or power relations between the strong and the weak economies. In its more kind of benign or defensive form, it attempts to protect the economy against untoward external economic and political forces. Defensive economic nationalism frequently exists in less developed economies or in those advanced economies that have begun to decline, where such governments pursue like protectionist and related policies to protect the nascent or declining industries and to safeguard domestic interests. In its more malevolent form, economic nationalism is the conduct of economic warfare, which is more prevalent in expanding powers. Now, post-World War II, neo-mercantilists in less developed countries became much more skeptical by the late 1940s and 50s of this kind of post-war US-led multilateral economic order, which we mentioned last week. And in this kind of context of this skepticism, a new generation of thinkers from the less industrialized regions of the world emerged to demand international economic reforms to better support their neo-mercantilist goals. So at this time, and this was kind of a part of the non-aligned movement, and US policymakers saw the non-aligned movement and more nationalist leaders saw these reforms as leaning in the direction of the status economic policies of the Soviets, but that wasn't usually and mostly often wasn't the case. Because these calls for increased power for these industrializing countries to industrialize their countries and build their state really just represented efforts to uphold and build on this kind of neo-mercantilism that had carved out this very distinctive ideological position in the so-called third world between economic liberalism and Marxism. And I mentioned this thinker, Raul Prebisch, last week. He was also, he's a dependency theorist, but also a very important, mercantilist thinker. Like I mentioned, he was the first head of the Economic Commission of Latin America, and then head of the United Nations Commission on Trade and Development. And Prebisch promoted what came to be called like a structuralist case for national governments to pursue strategic protectionism aimed at promoting industrialization in lower income countries, which was taken up by a lot of less developed countries. So now finally, this is our last place that we're going to be discussing world systems theory. And I have the same background as my liberalism slide. Sorry, team, but that's all right. Maybe it's still relevant to the world systems theory. Now, world systems theory originated in the early 1970s as this kind of new perspective on social reality. In the social sciences, there was 4 debates, which I'm not going to go into in any detail, but just to provide an outline. There's 4 debates in social sciences between like World War II and the 1970s, which set the scene for the emergence of world systems analysis. There's firstly the concept of core periphery, which is developed by that United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America, which Prebisch was on, and the subsequent elaboration of dependency theory. There was a debate around the utility of Marx's concept of the Asiatic mode of production, which took place among a lot of communist scholars at that time. The discussion among historians of Western Europe about the transition from feudalism to capitalism, which was at this moment a very live debate where there's not a huge amount of research done. And then the debate about what was known as like total history and the triumph of something called the Annales School, I believe, of historiography in France, and then in many parts of the world, which was a certain approach to history. Now, none of these debates were particularly new, but they became particularly salient in this period. And the result was a major challenge to the social sciences as they had developed at that time. Now, collectively, they kind of represented a big critique of existing structures of knowledge. This intellectual upheaval was followed by the cultural shock of 1968, and all of this brought these pieces together. Um, and like we mentioned before, the world revolution of 1968 kind of put into question the hegemony of the United States, and its world policies that led to like the Vietnam War, the relatively passive attitude of the Soviet Union, which was seen as colluding with the United States, and the inefficacy of the traditional left movements in opposing the status quo. So it's at this point in the early 1970s that people began to speak explicitly about world systems analysis as a perspective. And this was an attempt to combine coherently concern with the unit of analysis, concern with social temporalities, and concern with the barriers that had been erected between different social sciences disciplines. World systems analysis meant, first of all, the substitution of a unit of analysis called the world system for the standard unit of analysis, which was the national state. So, our realist, our liberal theories, they look at the national state as being their main unit of analysis in international relations. But instead, world systems theorists have put the world as the unit of analysis. And world systems started to also question whether any of the individual objects of study of many siloed academic spheres really existed. So historians looking at national histories, economists looking at national economies, political sciences looking at political structures. World systems questioned whether they actually existed, and whether they were the most useful place of analysis. So instead of just the narrow focus on either political or economic structures of a state, world systems theory looked at the entire globe and its history and everything in it. So it's a totalizing analysis. And it used and I guess analyzed these total social systems over the longue durée, right? That historical framework. Now, I mentioned the French Annales School because this a concept of longue durée came from the famous historian Braudel. Oh, my little cat, Layla. Hey, sweetie, hello. She just woke up. And Braudel was a very famous historian who insisted on the multiplicity of social times and his emphasis on structural time, which he called the longue durée. And we won't go into any more detail, but if you're interested, you can look at one of his books. But it became central to the world systems analysis, which basically meant that the longue durée was like the duration of a particular historical system. So, the longue durée of capitalism stretched back, for instance, to the enclosures of in England as one particular place where that happened. So by bringing the longue durée into the theorizing of the world system, it also avoided the traps of making the system seem as if it was a timeless, eternal truth. And if such systems were not eternal, then it followed that they had beginnings, lives during which they developed, and terminal transitions. And then another element in world systems analysis was its lack of deference to the traditional boundaries of the social sciences. It analyzed total social systems over the longue durée, and so it used materials that had once been considered the exclusive concern of historians or economists or political science or sociologists or anthropologists, and to use them in a single analytical framework. So this was a combination of a whole number of disciplines together. And it was kind of unidisciplinary as such. And so it basically put together the core periphery focus. So seeing the periphery sending or having had money and capital extracted from them to the economic core, and then looked to see, well, how did that this capital structure come through and evolve over the longue durée by looking at anthropology, economics, politics, all kinds of different fields. And Immanuel Wallerstein is kind of the outstanding scholar of world systems theory, and I'd recommend really having a look at his book. But I'm going to end it there because I think we've probably gone quite a bit over time, but there's a real, lot to get through. And I hope there's some things that were maybe new and interesting about neoliberalism that hasn't been mentioned before. And I look forward to seeing you all in the tutorials coming up. And yes, I'm looking forward to our tutorial activities as well. So keep well until then, team, and yeah, hopefully see you soon.